of all, and you can ask ChatGPT about this. Second of all,
I don't need to ask ChatGPT because ChatGPT is a predictive language model and not an alternate, not an AI, and not capable of it. ChatGPT gets stuff wrong all the time, and it is absolutely embarrassing rather than to suggest that you could address it.
Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today I've stumbled across an absolutely explosive debate between Matt Dillahunty and Matthew, and around the 52-minute, 57-second mark, Matt completely destroys Matthew's dice probability argument and calls him out for telling people to go ask ChatGPT instead of defending his own position. Then, at 1 minute 36 seconds, things get even more heated when Matt catches Matthew in multiple straw man fallacies, repeatedly twisting his words. It's honestly one of the most frustrating displays of dishonest debate tactics I've seen. Please comment down below where you're watching from. I really love to see people from all over the world connecting in here. Alright, now let's get into the video.
Right. But so both the constants and the initial conditions of the universe existed at the start of the universe. In both cases, there's a value that you could imagine them taking on, where it's very unlikely that they would take them on. Now, but let me address what you said like a minute ago, where you said, look, if the constants hadn't been that way, then we wouldn't have been around to observe it. That's not relevant to whether it's evidence for whether it's evidence for the existence of God. So as an analogy, if my parents had not had me, I would not have been around to observe that fact, or I would have been non-existent. But nonetheless, the fact that my parents did have me is good evidence that my parents did not use effective contraception. Or to use a famous case from the philosopher John Wesley, imagine there are 100 men who line up and there's a firing squad, and they all point their guns at you, and they all fire them, and all of them miss, and so you get away. And later you're thinking back and you're like, that's pretty improbable. All 100 of them miss? Maybe there's a conspiracy. Maybe something improbable happened. But then you've been watching an episode of the Matt Dillahunty show, and you say, no, nothing that improbable happened. Or if that hadn't happened, I wouldn't have been around to observe it. So, I couldn't have been around to observe myself not surviving. That would be a bad inference. It would still be evidence for a conspiracy. Similarly, your existence can still be evidence for the fine-tuning, for the existence of God.
I love how you're referring to parents and sex and 100 shots and all this stuff, when the problem here is that we have one universe, one set of circumstances, and that's all we can explore. We don't know if there are others, were there others, could there be others, none of that. And so, in this particular, how did you determine, is it possible for this universe to exist without a God intending it to exist?
Yeah, I think it's possible. I just think that it's much less likely than it existing with a God who intends it to exist.
Sure. Is it possible for me to roll double sixes?
Yes.
Is it also much less likely that if I rolled double sixes and you came along and looked at them, is it still much less likely that I rolled them than that I intentionally put them that way?
So you also have to look at the prior probability, which is how likely it is.
I'm sorry. We don't have any prior probability, and that's not an answer to my question.
Okay, so this is where the entire fine-tuning argument completely collapses, and I need you to pay attention to why. Matthew is trying to compare the physical constants of our universe to a hypothetical scenario where the initial conditions literally spell out "made by God" in every human language. And Matt immediately catches the problem with this comparison because it's not even remotely the same thing. Here's what Matthew doesn't seem to understand. When he talks about the constants being finely tuned, he's making this huge assumption that we could have had different constants. But Matt points out something crucial. Matt said this: we have one universe, one set of circumstances, and that's all we can explore. That's the entire problem right there. We don't have a sample size. We don't have multiple universes to compare against. We have one data point, and theists are trying to calculate probability from one observation. Think about it like this. If you walk into a room and there's a deck of cards sitting on the table in some random order, you could say, wow, the odds of that specific order are 1 in 52 factorial, which is basically impossible. But does that mean someone intentionally arranged them that way? No, because every possible arrangement is equally unlikely. The arrangement that exists had to be some arrangement. The fact that it's unlikely doesn't mean it was designed. But here's where Matthew's argument gets really dishonest. He creates this fictional scenario where the constants spell out a message in human languages that wouldn't even exist for billions of years after the universe began. And when Matt calls him out on this, Matthew just keeps trying to compare it to the cosmological constant as if they're the same thing. They're not the same thing. Matt absolutely destroys this when he said, "You've created a fictional scenario that is used as an intuition pump to deceive people into accepting something that is unwarranted." And that's exactly what's happening here. Matthew is using a science fiction hypothetical to make you feel like the fine-tuning argument makes sense. But when you actually examine it, the comparison falls apart completely. The constants of physics don't predict Spanish or English or any human language. Human language is a product of the constants working over billions of years of evolution. But in Matthew's made-up scenario, the message would have to exist before the things it's describing could even exist. That's fundamentally backwards causation, and it shows how desperate the argument really is. And you can hear the frustration in Matt's voice when he says, "Show me in the constants how it is written with love from God in every language," because he knows Matthew can't do that. The entire argument relies on you accepting a fictional story instead of dealing with the actual reality we live in. This is why theistic arguments so often depend on hypotheticals and thought experiments instead of actual evidence.
If you come across and see that there are a double six dice on the table, is it still more likely, you not knowing what happened, that this is the result of someone intentionally setting them to double sixes than it is that they rolled them fairly?
Yeah, I actually don't know which one's more likely, but the difference between this and the God case is that I agree that the fact that they're both set to 1, that would be evidence that someone set it that way, rather than just rolling it by chance. But probably people are more likely to roll dice than to set them in a particular way, so you also have to look at the priors. That's why in my opening statement, I analyzed the prior probability of God's existence. Okay, so
The problem here is that you've completely ignored and reframed the question. The answer is that the likelihood of those sixes being rolled or not does not change based on the information you have in any given time.
Yeah, so that isn't right. You observing 2 6s, that's evidence that they were set to get 2 6s. It might not be sufficient evidence, but it is evidence because it's more likely on the assumption that they were both set to be 6s than on the assumption that they were not.
This is just not. You are inverting things. The fact that X is more likely on Y doesn't mean that the existence of X makes Y more likely.
It literally does. If you Google definition of
conditional
probability,
not. It does not in any way. So if you're sitting here and so first of all, you know what the odds of rolling double sixes is. It's 1 in 36. And you know that because we know a great deal about dice and we know how to calculate the odds. And we know that on a single roll, I could roll double sixes. And when those hit the table, anybody walking by who didn't see me roll them would still have to acknowledge that it was more likely that this was intentionally set there than that it was rolled fairly. And so when you ask that person the question, hey, which of these is more likely? It's more likely on God. It's more likely on someone setting it. Which one actually happened is the question we're actually asking. If you say, Matt, is it more likely for a universe like this to exist if there's a magical being that can intentionally make a universe like this? My answer is yes, absolutely. Now, what is the right answer for why this instance occurred? You cannot go from statistical analysis and then say, here's an instance, what was the cause? It doesn't matter whether it's more likely under God or not. That doesn't in any way demonstrate that that was the cause, which is evidenced in part by the fact that we're calculating the odds for dice rolls. We don't include God in the calculations.
So I think you should. So first of all, regarding your claim about conditional probability, that's a straightforwardly false mathematical claim. If A is likelier given B than given not B, then B is likelier given A than not A. Okay. Second of all, and you can ask ChatGPT about this. Second of all,
I don't need to ask ChatGPT because ChatGPT is a predictive language model and not an alternate, not an AI, and not capable of it. ChatGPT gets stuff wrong all the time, and it is absolutely embarrassing. Rather than to suggest that you could address it, to tell me to go talk to ChatGPT. I'd rather go
Well,
talk
I mean,
to
if
a fake
like, I
girlfriend.
we could go through like the derivation of it or something. But anyways,
I don't need
so
to go through
second
the
of all,
derivation. I need you to demonstrate that merely because it's a universe like this is more probable on a God that wants to create this universe, that is in fact the correct answer for this universe. The problem with this
so
is that you cannot look at any specific occurrence and say, oh, it is more probable. You can say it's more probably the result of this, but you can't say this is more probable based on this observation.
So, Matt, what I said in my opening statement was that if you want to look at whether a conclusion is reasonable to believe, what you have to do is not merely look at its explanation of the data, but you also have to look at the prior probability, right? So, if you get one lucky hand in poker, it's true that the theory that you're cheating explains why you would get that. It's some evidence for that hypothesis, but it's not ultimately reasonable to believe because it's not enough evidence to overcome the low prior. That's why in my opening statement, I gave several different lines of evidence, and I argued that they have significant weight, both individually and cumulatively. Sorry, I do have one question. Can you tell me anything that would be evidence for God's existence on your view?
No.
Okay, nothing would be evidence for God?
No, that's not what I said.
So now we get into the dice probability discussion. And this is where you can really see the difference between someone who understands statistics and someone who's just using statistics to justify what they already believe. Matt breaks down this crucial point. He said, the answer is that the likelihood of those sixes being rolled or not does not change based on the information you have in any given time. Let me explain why this matters so much. When you roll 2 dice and they come up double sixes, yes, it's more likely that someone could have set them that way intentionally than that they were rolled fairly. But here's the key part. You can't look at one instance of double sixes and conclude, therefore, someone must have set them intentionally. That's not how probability works. Matthew keeps trying to use this conditional probability argument. He said, if A is likelier given B than given not B, then B is likelier given A than not A. And technically that's true in Bayesian reasoning. But what Matthew is missing is that you also need to know the prior probability. How likely is it that someone would be sitting around intentionally setting dice to double sixes versus how likely is it that someone would roll dice? And we don't have that information for the universe. We don't know if universe creating beings exist. We don't know how many universes there are. We don't know if the constants could have been different. Matthew is filling in all these unknown probabilities with assumptions that favor his conclusion, and then acting like he's done rigorous mathematical analysis. It's circular reasoning dressed up in probability theory. But here's where it gets really good. Matthew tells Matt to go ask ChatGPT about the conditional probability. And Matt just shuts that down immediately. Matt said, I don't need to ask ChatGPT because ChatGPT is a predictive language model and not an AI and not capable of it. And then he follows up with, it is absolutely embarrassing. Rather than to suggest that you could address it, to tell me to go talk to ChatGPT. And that is absolutely right to be frustrated here. When you're in a philosophical debate about fundamental epistemology and someone tells you to go ask a chatbot instead of actually defending their position, that's intellectually lazy. Matthew is supposed to be making an argument for why we should believe in God. And when pressed on the statistical reasoning, he's just deflecting to an AI language model. That's not how you demonstrate truth. The problem with the theistic fine-tuning argument is that it's always working backwards from the conclusion. They start with the belief that God exists. Then they look at the universe and say, well, this seems really unlikely, so God must have done it. But that's not following the evidence where it leads. That's finding ways to justify what you already believed. And when someone like Matt, who actually understands probability theory, pushes back, the whole argument starts falling apart, which is exactly what we're seeing here.
And also, you misrepresented this. No, would you let me finish? Because you misrepresented me already in your rebuttal, and now you're trying to misrepresent me again when I answered your question. So you said that I said that hard data and empirical evidence were required to believe in God. I didn't say that, nor is that my position. You just asked me if I could give you an example of what would count as evidence, and I said no, and you tried to reframe that as if I was saying there is nothing that would be evidence. The fact that I can't give you an example of what would qualify is not me saying there is nothing that would qualify. My answer to this, which I've given for 20 years probably, is that I don't know what it would take to convince me that a God exists. And this is why I started with something from Arthur C. Clarke, because I don't know how to tell the difference between a sufficiently advanced technology and magic. But if there's a God, God absolutely knows what would change my mind and should be capable of doing it. And the fact that this hasn't happened means that either that God doesn't exist or that this God doesn't want me to know it exists yet. But in no point does me saying no to can you provide an example of what evidence would convince you of God, in no way is that equivalent to me saying there is no evidence that would convince me of God. That is just utterly dishonest.
Yeah, so, okay, so you say that you think there likely is some evidence that you could convince you of the existence of God. If there is a God,
I didn't
that
say that
God would
either.
know what it is.
I didn't say that either. It's like you're not listening to a word I say. I said that I can't give you an example. I didn't say there wasn't any example, and I didn't say whether it was likely there would or could be an example. You are rephrasing everything I've said in a way that is absolutely dishonest in what I actually said. So try again.
You said that if there was a God, then that God would know what it was that could convince you that he exists. Okay, so it sounds like there is something.
If there is a God, by your definition of God, that God knows facts, knows all facts, and therefore that God knows what facts would convince me and knows the facts about what should convince me. That's it.
Okay, so
that doesn't mean
there are any facts that convince you?
I don't know that there are any facts. I don't know that there's any God. Do you understand hypotheticals? Where if God, okay, cool. If God and God knows, and if there is something that would convince me that God knows it, I have no idea whether either of those are true. You're the one claiming that one of them is true. That's it.
Yeah. Well, to be clear, I don't know if there are any facts that would convince you. I think there are facts that make it reasonable to believe. I don't know what would convince you.
I don't either.
So one question. In my opening statement, I described a view called the self-indication assumption, which is the view according to which your existence is more probable given a theory on which there are more people that presently exist.
Yep.
Do you accept the self-indication assumption? And if not, what do you make of the argument I gave for the self-indication assumption?
I think it's the exact same thing phrased a different way, which is it more likely? Is my existence more consistent with a God that created a universe that wanted to result in me? Yes. But my existence is not confirmation that that is what actually happened.
Okay, so, and I've given my reply to that, which is I think that your existence is likelier if there's a God that wants to create you than if there's not. But it's not.
This is irrelevant.
If I get it,
no.
It's not
okay. This isn't just. This is 20 back and forth. That is not all just you asking me questions. I have questions to ask you as well. But go ahead.
I mean, I was finished. I finished before you said your thing. Sorry. Go ahead. Ask a question if you'd like.
Why is it good to create life?
Well, I think the reason to create life, the reason why that's good, is that it's good when people exist, when they have happiness over the course of their life. One of the most widely agreed upon views among philosophers about what things are good is that, happiness is a good thing. And so if there's a being who can bring about very large amounts of happiness, and they have no constraints on how much of it they can do, and they're morally perfect, then it's likely that they would bring it about, or at least not very unlikely. And I think anyone who's not an antinatalist should accept this. They should accept it's good to create people.
The problem is that you're just brushing off antinatalism and then scooping everything in with antinatalism. So if God doesn't, in your model, does God just create happiness?
God creates people who he gives good lives to, and I think these lives are particularly good when you take into account.
What about the people who don't have good lives? What about the people who don't have good lives? So I don't think there are any people who will ultimately not have good lives, because I think God will ensure an infinitely good afterlife for everyone. I think that's what your solution. So your solution to the problem with reality is to posit an extended reality for which you don't have evidence, and that's where the good comes.
No, I don't not have evidence for it. We have evidence in the form of evidence for the existence of God, and if there's a perfect God, and it's good to give people an infinitely good reality, well, then God would be expected to do that.
This moment right here is peak intellectual honesty versus rhetorical games. And you need to understand exactly what's happening because it's so important. Matthew asks Matt if anything would count as evidence for God. And Matt says no. And immediately, Matthew tries to twist that into Matt saying there's nothing that could ever be evidence for God's existence. But that's not what Matt said at all. Matt comes back and absolutely calls him out. Matt said, "You just asked me if I could give you an example of what would count as evidence. And I said no. And you tried to reframe that as if I was saying there is nothing that would be evidence." Do you see the difference? Matt is saying, I personally cannot think of an example right now, versus claiming that no example could possibly exist. Those are two completely different statements. And then Matt drives the point home when he said, "You are rephrasing everything I've said in a way that is absolutely dishonest in what I actually said." And this happens again. Matthew keeps trying to put words in Matt's mouth, and Matt has to keep correcting him. Matt said, "You're not listening to a word I say. I said that I can't give you an example. I didn't say there wasn't any example." This is a classic theist debate tactic. They misrepresent your position into something easier to attack, and then they attack that instead of what you actually said. It's a textbook straw man fallacy. But here's why this matters beyond just debate tactics. Matt is being intellectually honest about the limits of his knowledge. He's saying, look, I don't know what would convince me, but if there is a God, then that God would know what would convince me and could present that evidence. That's a reasonable epistemological position. You don't have to have all the answers mapped out in advance to recognize that the current arguments aren't convincing. Meanwhile, Matthew is so convinced he's right that he can't even accurately represent what his opponent is saying. He's so focused on defending his belief in God that he's willing to mischaracterize Matt's position multiple times in the span of a few minutes. And when someone is that intellectually dishonest in a debate, it makes you question whether their arguments can be trusted at all. Now Matthew tries to pivot to this self-indication assumption, which is basically the idea that your existence is more likely if more people exist. And look, this is getting into some really abstract philosophy, but the fundamental problem remains the same. Matthew is using these complicated philosophical frameworks to try to argue backwards to God, but he never establishes the basic premises. He never demonstrates that it's good for a perfect being to create anything. He never demonstrates that the constants could have been different. He never demonstrates that we should expect an infinite number of people to exist. He just asserts these things and then builds elaborate arguments on top of unproven foundations. And that's the core issue with so much theistic apologetics. It sounds sophisticated, it uses big words and mathematical concepts, but when you actually dig into the reasoning, it's all built on assumptions that were never justified. Matt is doing the hard work of actually questioning those assumptions and demanding that they be demonstrated rather than just accepted. And that's why, even though this debate gets heated, Matt is clearly on much stronger logical ground. The theist wants you to accept their premises so they can lead you to their conclusion. The atheist is saying, wait, why should I accept your premises in the first place? And that question is what makes the entire argument collapse, because the premises can't be demonstrated. They can only be assumed if you already believe the conclusion. So what do you guys think of this? Leave your thoughts down in the comments. Please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.